And then I'm gonna mute myself on this thing on
Yeah.
Zoom.
Yes. Okay. Bismillah.
You
All right. I guess I can start. So this is chapter number 6. It is called The Anthropocosmic Vision. And we're going to read up to page 121, inshallah. Right now we're on page 109. Bismillah. I take the expression anthropocosmic vision from Tu Weiming, professor of Chinese history and philosophy and Confucian studies at Harvard University, and director of the Harvard Yenching Institute. Professor Tu has used it for many years to encapsulate the East Asian worldview and stress its salient differences with the theocentric and anthropocentric worldviews of the West. By saying that the Chinese traditions in general and Confucianism in particular see things anthropocosmically. He wants to say that the Chinese thinkers and sages have understood human beings and the cosmos as a single organismic whole. The goal of human life is to harmonize oneself with heaven and earth and to return to the transcendent source of both humans and the world. As long as Chinese civilization retained its anthropocosmic vision, it could not develop instrumental rationality, the Enlightenment view that sees that the world as a conglomeration of objects, and understands knowledge as the means to control the world. In the anthropocosmic vision, the object cannot be disjoined from the subject. The purpose of knowledge is not to manipulate the world, but to understand the world and ourselves so that we can live up to the fullness of our humanity. The aim, to use one of Tu Weiming's favorite phrases, is to learn how to be human. As he writes, the way is nothing other than the actualization of true human nature. With slight revisions in terminology, Tu Weiming's depiction of the anthropocosmic vision could easily be employed to describe the overarching worldview of Islamic civilization in general, and the intellectual tradition in particular. For the purpose of this chapter, I will focus more on the philosophical side of the tradition. I do so because, first, among all the Islamic approaches to knowledge, philosophy has produced figures who have been looked back upon by Western historians and modern day Muslims as quote unquote scientists in something like the current meaning of the word. And second, only this approach has discussed the significance of being and becoming without presupposing faith in Islamic dogma. So its language can more easily be understood outside of the context of specifically Islamic imagery. Ahistorical and historical knowledge. In Western civilization, a sharp distinction has commonly been drawn between reason and revelation, or Athens and Jerusalem. In order to understand the role that the intellectual sciences have played in the Islamic tradition, we need to understand that the predominant Islamic perspective has seen reason and revelation as harmonious and complementary, not antagonistic. The very content of the Quranic message led to a viewpoint that diverges sharply from what became normative in the Christian West. Without understanding the divergent viewpoint, we will find it difficult to grasp the role that wisdom has played in Islam. If you look at Christianity in terms of the dichotomy between intellectual and transmitted knowledge, what immediately strikes the eye is that the fundamental truths are indebted to transmission, not intellection. The defining notion of the Christian worldview, to the extent that it is meaningful to generalize about a complex and many sided tradition, is the incarnation, an historical event whose occurrence is known through transmitted knowledge. To be sure, the incarnation was seen as a divine intervention that transmuted history, but it was also understood as occurring in the full light of historical actuality. In order to know about it, people needed the transmission of historical reports. The Islamic tradition has a very different starting point. It is often assumed by both Muslims and non Muslims that Islam began with the historical event of Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the Quran. There is some truth in this, of course, but the Quran paints a different picture, one that has had a deep effect on the way people have conceived of their religion. In this perspective, Islam began with the creation of the world. In its broadest meaning, the word Islam, submission, submittedness, surrender, designates the universal and ever present situation of creatures in face of the Creator. To him is submitted everything in the heavens and the earth. Quran, Surah 3, verse 83. This helps explain why the first and fundamental dogma of religion is Tawheed, which has nothing to do with historical facts of Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the Quran. Tawheed is the acknowledgement of a universal truth that expresses the actual situation of all things for all time and all eternity, since everything submits to God's unity by the very fact of its existence. Only human beings among all creatures have the peculiar status of being able, in certain respect, to accept or reject this truth. To accept it freely is to utter the first half of the Shahada and give witness to the unique reality of God. The Quran attributes Tawheed and the free acceptance of its consequences to all rightly guided people, beginning with Adam and extending down through all the prophets and all those who correctly and sincerely followed them. It might be objected that the statement of Tawheed is itself historically particular. But the issue is not its linguistic formulation, but rather the unique, unitary reality that gives rise to the universe. Note that the Quran says that God sends every message in the language of the Prophet's people. Quran Surah 14, verse 4. And that each community has a messenger. Quran Surah 10, verse 47. The basic content of every message was Tawheed. And we never sent a messenger before you, save that we revealed to him, saying, there is no God but I, so serve me. Quran Surah 21, Ayah 25. There is no God but I is the first truth of every message, the first half of its Shahada. Serve me lays down the necessity for a second Shahada, to delineate the specific forms of service, ibadah, worship, appropriate to the cultural and historical context of the people to whom the message is addressed. One might also object that this unitary reality is itself historically particular because it was invented by human minds. People who hold this position still have to justify it, so they cannot escape a metaphysics. On what basis do we declare history, language, politics, gender, atoms, energy, the brain, genes, or whatever else foundational? Notice, moreover, that such theories are always rooted in forms of transmitted knowledge that go back to historical authorities who function as quote unquote prophets for believers in the theories. One is reminded of the old joke heard among scholars of Islam, at least, that Marxism boils down to this Shahada: there is no God and Karl Marx is his messenger. In the Islamic perspective, Tawheed stands outside history and outside transmission. It is a universal truth that does not depend on revelation. Understanding it is an inherent quality of the innate disposition, fitrah, of Adam and his children. The fall from paradise does not represent a serious shortcoming, but rather a temporary lapse, a single act of forgetfulness and disobedience. The lapse had repercussions, to be sure, but it was immediately forgiven by God, and Adam was designated as the first prophet. Alayhi salam. His divine image was in no way blemished by the fall, even if it does become obscured in many, if not most, of his children. Tawheed precedes Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his revealed message, because it does not pertain to history. It informs all true knowledge in all times and all places. Every one of the 124,000 prophets brought it as the basis of the message. They did not teach it, however, in order to establish an authoritative belief system that could be transmitted to others. Rather, they taught it because people have a tendency to forget and need to be reminded. Dhikr. The word dhikr, along with its derivatives, tadkir, tadkhira, and dhikra, designates one of the most important concepts in the Quran. It informs Islamic religiosity on every level of faith and practice. It means not only to remind, but also to remember. In the sense of reminder, it indicates the primary function of the prophets. And in the sense of remembrance, it designates the proper human response to the prophetic reminder. The whole process of learning how to be human depends first upon being reminded of Tawheed, and second upon active and free remembrance. If the first half of the Shahada stands outside history, the second half, Muhammad is God's messenger, is firmly grounded within it. It refers to the historical particularities of the Islamic tradition, which began in the 7th Christian century with the revelation of the Quran. Thus, the two halves of the Shahada implicitly distinguish between a universal, ahistorical truth and a particular historical and conditioned truth. Simultaneously, they distinguish between intellectual and transmitted knowledge. The first half articulates a knowledge innate to the original human disposition and accessible to all human beings. And the second half establishes the authority of a specific historical message embodied in the Quran, the message of Muhammad, peace be upon him, with all its detailed teachings. The philosophical quest. Among all the schools of Islamic thought, the philosophers were the most careful to distinguish between transmitted and intellectual learning. They themselves were not primarily interested in transmitted knowledge, compared to jurists, theologians, and Sufis. Philosophers paid little attention to the Quran, the Hadith, and the religious sciences. It is true, nonetheless, that most of them were well versed in the transmitted religious learning, and some even wrote Quranic commentaries and juridical works. They were not hostile to the transmitted learning, but rather focused their attention elsewhere. They wanted to develop their own intellectual vision by working out the implications of Tawheed in theory and in practice. The philosophers undertook the quest for wisdom with the ultimate aim of transforming their souls. As Tu Beiming says of the Confucian anthropocosmic vision, the transformative act is predicated on a transcendent vision that ontologically we are infinitely better and therefore more worthy than we actually are. This is a humanistic vision, but a humanism that is elevated far beyond the mundane, because the measure of all things is not man or even rational understanding, but the transcendent source of all. As Tu puts it, since the value of the human is not anthropocentric, the assertion that man is the measure of all things is not humanistic enough. To fully express our humanity, we must engage in a dialogue with heaven, because human nature, as conferred by heaven, realizes its nature not by departing from its source, but by returning to it. Humanity, so conceived, is the public property of the cosmos, not the private possession of the anthropological world, and is as much the defining characteristic of our being as the self conscious manifestation of heaven. Humanity is heaven's form of self disclosure, self expression, and self realization. If we fail to live up to our humanity, we fail cosmologically in our mission as co creator of heaven and earth, and morally in our duty as fellow participants in the great cosmic transformation. For the Islamic wisdom tradition, grasping the full nature of our humanity necessitates the investigating the nature of things and their reality of our own selves. This meant that intellectuals could not limit themselves to the mere acceptance of transmitted learning. They could not ignore the human imperative to search for knowledge in every domain, especially not when the Quran explicitly commands the study of the cosmos and the soul as the means to know God. Although some philosophers paid little attention to the transmitted learning and had no patience with the quibbling of theologians and jurists, they did not step outside of Islam because they could not doubt the universal and ahistorical axiom upon which it is built. In other words, there was no historical chink in their intellectual armor. Historical contingencies cannot touch Tawheed because once it is grasped, it is seen as so foundational that it becomes the unique certainty upon which the soul can depend. As for the theologians and jurists and their claims to authority in religious matters, the representatives of the wisdom tradition saw those claims as pertaining to transmitted learning, not intellectual learning, and they found no reason to submit themselves to the limited understandings of pious dogmatists. To a large degree, they kept themselves apart from theological and juridical bickering, and this helps explain why the philosophers among them, in contrast to the Sufis, prefer to employ a language colored more by Greek models than the imagery and symbols of the Quran. Once we recognize that Islamic intellectual learning stands aloof from transmitted learning, it becomes clear why modern scientific enterprise could not have arisen in Islam. Science gains its power from rejection of any sort of teleology, brute separation of subject and object, refusal to admit that consciousness and awareness are more real than material facts, exclusive concern with the domain of the senses, and disregard for the ultimate and transcendent. Instrument and rationality could appear in the West only after the baby had been thrown out with the bathwater. Having rejected the bathwater of theology, or at least the relevance of theological dogma to scientific concerns, Western philosophers and scientists also rejected the truth of Tawhid, the bedrock of human intelligence. Once Tawheed was a dead letter, every domain of learning could be considered an independent realm. Instrumental rationality did not appear suddenly in the West, of course. A long and complex history gradually brought about an increasingly wider separation between the domains of reason and revelation. Many scientists and philosophers remained practicing Christians, but this did not prevent them from considering the rational domain free from the trammels of revealed givens. It is precisely because these givens were posed in the dogmatic and historical terms of transmitted learning rather than the open ended and ahistorical terms of intellectual learning that the separation between reason and revelation could occur. In contrast, the Muslim intellectuals kept themselves rooted in the vision of Tawheed. No matter what sort of misgivings some of them may have entertained concerning the historical contingency of the Arabic language, the events surrounding the appearance of Muhammad, peace be upon him, the transmission of the Quranic revelation, and the interpretation of the revelation by the theologians and dogmatists, they did not see these as impinging on the fundamental insight of Tawheed, which for them was utterly transparent. My first conclusion, then, is this. Many historians have suggested that medieval Islamic learning declined when Muslim scientists neglected to build on their early discoveries. But this is to read Islamic history in terms of the ideology of progress, which in turn is rooted in contemporary scientism, the belief that science has the same sort of unique reliability that was once reserved for revealed truth. Scientism gives absolute importance to scientific theories and relativizes all other approaches to knowledge. This is not to deny that there was a decline in Islamic learning. It is simply to call into question the criteria by which such things are normally judged. Why should historical oddities, such as the ideological presuppositions of modernity, be the yardstick for civilization? If we keep in view Islamic criteria, e.g., adherence to Tawheed, the Quran, and the Sunnah, there was certainly a serious decline, but that decline cannot be measured by the criteria that are normally applied. Moreover, historians who talk in broad terms of the decline of the Islamic quote unquote science fail to acknowledge the profound difference between two historical contexts. The first is the Islamic, in which the axiom of Tawheed infused all intellectual endeavor. The philosophers saw all things as beginning, flourishing, and ending within the compass of the one source, so they could not split up the domains of reality in more than a tentative way. They were not able to disengage knowledge of the cosmos from knowledge of God or knowledge of the soul. It was impossible for them to imagine the world and the self as separate from each other or from the one principle. Quite the contrary, the more they investigated the universe, the more they saw it as displaying Tawheed and the nature of the self. They could not have agreed more with Tu Weiming, who writes, to see nature as an external object out there is to create an artificial barrier which obstructs our true vision and undermines our human capacity to experience nature from within. The second context that people tend to forget when they claim that the Muslim intellectual tradition declined is the Christian. Christian civilization, qua Christian civilization, did in fact decline, and many have argued disappeared because it experienced the breakdown of a synthetic worldview. Part of the reason for this breakdown and the concurrent rise of a secular and scientific worldview was that the transmitted nature of the basic religious givens was not able to withstand the critical questioning of non dogmatic thinkers. In the Islamic case, Muslim intellectuals did not depend on revelation and transmission for their understanding of Tawheed, so theological squabbles and historical uncertainties could not touch their basic vision of reality. The methodology of tahqiq. In order to suggest some of the implications of the anthropocosmic vision, I need to expand a bit more on the distinction between intellectual and transmitted. The experts in transmitted learning claimed authority for their knowledge by upholding the truthfulness of those who provided the knowledge, that is, God, Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the pious forebears, and the authenticity of the transmission. They asked all Muslims to accept this knowledge as it was received. The basic duty of the Muslim believer was taqlid, imitation or submission to the authority of the transmitted knowledge. In contrast, the intellectual tradition appealed to the relatively small number of people who had the appropriate aptitudes. The quest for knowledge was defined in terms of tahqiq. verifying and realizing the truth for oneself. If we fail to see the knowledge achieved by realization is not the same sort of knowledge achieved by imitation, we will not be able to understand what the Muslim intellectuals were trying to do, or what modern scientists and scholars are trying to do. We will continue to falsify the position of the Muslim philosophers by making them precursors of modern science, as if they were trying to discover what modern scientists try to discover, and as if they accepted the findings of their predecessors on the basis of imitation, as modern scientists do. Given that scientism infuses modern culture, it is difficult for moderns to remember that the whole scientific edifice is built on transmitted learning. Despite all the talk of the empirical verification of scientific findings, this verification depends on assumptions about the nature of reality that cannot be verified by empirical methods. Even if you accept for a moment that scientific proposition that scientific knowledge is uniquely quote unquote objective, it is in fact verifiable only by a handful of specialists, since the rest of the human race does not have the necessary training. In effect, everyone has to accept empirical verification on the basis of hearsay. As Appleyard puts it, scientists who insist that they are telling us how the world incontrovertibly is are asking for our faith in their subjective certainty of their own objectivity. It was noted that the word tahqiq derives from the word haq, meaning truth, true, real, right, proper, just, appropriate. When the word haq is applied to God, it means that God is the absolutely true, right, real, and proper. But the word is also applied to everything other than God. This secondary application acknowledges that everything in the universe has a truth, a rightness, a realness, and an appropriateness. God is haq in the absolute sense, and everything other than God is haq in the relative sense. The task of tahqiq is to build on the knowledge of the absolute haq, beginning with the axiom of Tawheed, and to grasp the exact nature of the relative haq that pertains to each thing, or at least to each thing with which we come into contact, whether spiritually, intellectually, psychologically, physically, or socially. The formula of Tawheed tells us that there is no God but God, no haq but the absolute haq. This haq is transcendent, infinite, and eternal, and nothing else can be worthy of the name. Nonetheless, all things are creations of God, having received everything that they are from Him. He creates them with the wisdom and purpose, and each has a role to play in the universe. Nothing that exists is inherently batil, false, vain, unreal, inappropriate. This is not to say that there is no such thing as evil. The issue of discerning the haqq of evil is one of the most subtle dimensions of tahqiq. Recognizing a thing's haqq may well entail acknowledging that part of its proper role is to be on an occasion for evil and that the appropriate human response is to avoid it. The very need to avoid evil alerts us to something of its cosmic function. Its possibility bestows meaning and significance on human freedom. The haqqs of individual things are determined by God's wisdom in creation. It is in respect to these individual haqqs that the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, "Give to each that has a haqq its haqq," a command that sums up the goal of tahqiq. To achieve this is obviously more than a simple cognitive activity. We cannot give things their rightful due simply by knowing their truth and reality. Over and above knowing, tahqiq demands acting. It is not simply to verify the truth and the reality of a thing. It is also to act toward the thing in the appropriate and rightful manner. Seekers of wisdom then were trying to verify and realize things. They could not do this by quoting the opinions of Aristotle or Plato, nor by citing the words of the Quran or the Prophet, peace be upon him. They could take the prophets and the great philosophers as guides on the path to realization, but they could not claim to know what the prophets and sages knew unless they discovered it for themselves. The quest demanded training the mind and disciplining the soul. It demanded the achievement of an authentic vision of reality, a correct perception of the world, a sound understanding of the self, a true knowledge of the first principle, and the activity in terms of what one had come to know. Should I continue, Fadbe, or should I stop?
I think
Okay.
Jazakallah khairan.